Hey everyone, Classical Theist here. What I'm going to do here is basically respond to a challenge that Godless Cranium posted to his channel. Um, I responded to Godless Cranium, one of his videos, a number of months ago, maybe some of you will remember. But his challenge is basically this. What benefits does Christianity offer to civilization that couldn't really otherwise be fulfilled by something atheistic? Honestly, I think it's kind of a new version of Christopher Hitchens' old challenge that he would pose to Christians in the audiences, like name a moral action that only a Christian could perform consistently that an atheist couldn't. Something to that effect. I think this is basically the new version of it. Right off the bat, though, I really think the question is already, it can't get off the ground because it's founded on pragmatism. When Christianity is entirely incompatible with pragmatism because it rests on truth claims. It rests on propositions that are either true or false. If they're true, then Christianity would be beneficial solely by virtue of its being true. And if it's false, then it would be harmful solely by virtue of its being false, unless you don't really take any inherent value in truth. But if you don't do that, then intellectual debate itself would seem to be rather pointless. More to it, though, the benefits of Christianity, aside from being true, are, for the most part, primarily of a spiritual nature, by which I mean intellectual. That is, not merely intellectual, of course, but I'm going to qualify it. It provides a means by which man, and this is assuming Christianity is true, of course, it provides a means by which man can attain union with God in the beatific vision. Since man is, on Christianity, a rational animal, he has as his primary end the attainment of truth itself. Since truth is none other than being as ascertained by the intellect, and since being as such in its pure unconditioned form is none other than God's very essence on Christianity, then it would follow that the primary end of man would be to know the very substance of this unconditioned being, since it is the fullness of truth itself. Not only that, but the will, the human will, the faculty of the will, seeks the good, which on Christianity, it defines the good as just being as sought after by the human will. And so truth and goodness are ultimately one and the same substance, unconditioned, absolutely simple, fully itself in the divine essence. The divine essence is, on Christianity, the subsistent act of being itself, and man is being defined as a rational animal, has his main faculties derived from his rationality as the intellect and will, and the intellect is what gets at the truth, and the will is what's going to get at the good. But the good and the true are ultimately the same in God. They collapse ultimately in the same substance, being itself, unconditioned being itself. So while everyone can agree that the intellect and will obviously tend toward particular truths, particular individuated truths and individuated goods, respectively, on Christianity, one would have to concede that the intellect and will not only tend toward particular individuated truths and goods, respectively, but ultimately tend toward attaining these things in themselves, which again, on Christianity, ultimately is one and the same with what's meant by God, who would be the unconditioned, infinite, unlimited, and absolutely simple act of being itself, pure actuality, self-subsistent existence, the wellspring of perfection, and so on. There are a lot of words to that Christian theologians and philosophers have used to classify the divine. And in Christianity, particularly, we have a means by which this can be attained. And that is whereby God unites himself to human nature, and in so doing provides us with a bridge to traverse this infinite gap, and man can unite himself to this unification of humanity and divinity, and in so doing share in the perfection of this unification, which fulfills the ends towards which the intellect and will are by nature striving. And obviously, this is assuming Christianity is true, but that's my point. The truth of it is the crux of the matter here. So, of course, one would have to prove the existence of God and establish the metaphysical framework that renders this rationally binding. But the point is that it's the truth claim of the system that accounts for whether or not it's beneficial. And we have to contend with that to get at the heart of the matter. So basically, the original question is ill-formed in my judgment. But So just based on that alone, if we can grant that Christianity is true for the sake of argument, of course it would be more beneficial. Of course it would be infinitely more beneficial than an atheistic system. But okay, let's go beyond that and try to make a more probabilistic case, and try to follow through with the original question, even though I think it's malformed. Even then, I think that there are other things we can point to. I mean, the simple fact that Christianity alone, and I'm only going to give like a few examples here, I could give many more. Um, the simple fact that Christianity alone historically has offered, I think, the material ingredients to give rise to the scientific revolution. Uh, I think that's a big one, because I submit that this accounts for the historical scientific stillbirths that occurred when non-Western cultures attempted to make use or develop uh, certain replicants or prefigurements of the scientific method. Uh, the fact is that if a culture lacks the certainty that the world is fundamentally intelligible, given the principle of intelligibility already imbued within it from an intelligible source prior to human engagement, which would be the mind of God, which is really the only way that we can account for something abstract being imbued within something prior to human engagement. Uh, because at that point, if it's abstract within the thing itself, then that abstraction would have to be sourced in something of that same nature. And that's why we would say it would be the mind of God. And if the culture doesn't have that, it simply will not value probing into the depths of nature and uncovering its mysteries. Pagan cultures divinized nature, and in so doing, lacked the impetus to really probe into it in any way parallel to what came out of the scientific revolution in the West. And this also, coupled with their cyclical view of history, ultimately rendered any kind of scientific endeavors that would parallel what took place in the West utterly in vain. We really often take it for granted, I think, that it was Christianity's eschatological view of the world that provides us with this linear, progressive in terms of having a certain endpoint in mind to strive toward. That progressivist view of history that is pretty much taken for granted now. We don't really think in any other terms. And I simply don't think that the atheistic worldview left unto itself could really produce fruits like this, because essentially, if there's nothing within that system that can account for the intrinsic knowability of nature itself, within nature, that would precede human engagement, then I don't see a basis for what gave rise to the scientific revolution in the West, because it did include that component necessarily so. And just logically speaking, if everything is merely reduced to concrete particulars with no forms or abstract universals inherent in nature, if nominalism is true, which atheism I think has to yield to, there is absolutely no guarantee that it will yield to rational patterns that can be presupposed by way of induction. We just have to take it for granted with our concoction of laws of nature, which, by the way, began as theological stipulations. The great scientific pioneers like Newton and Leibniz and others saw the laws of nature purely through the prism of divine causality. We often forget that. And once that theological justification was gone, subsequent to the Enlightenment, we kept the laws of nature, but we didn't really offer a way of explaining what they fundamentally are, what they fundamentally were, rather. This is an epistemological crisis in science today. I mean, David Hume's regularity theory of the laws of nature is really losing credibility more by the day if you look at the literature and philosophy of science. But I kind of digress. The point is, I simply don't think that scientific progress could have exploded the way it did without those principles of Christian worldview uniquely contributed. And there's also morality. And no, I'm not saying that atheists can't be moral, or that even they can't really concoct an ethical system of their own that can at least be somewhat coherent. But I submit that the only kind of morality that an atheist could rationally construct would have to be of like a social construct variety. It can't universally inhere in human nature, because atheism simply metaphysically speaking, cannot allow for there to exist an abstract human nature that transcends particular human beings. And it's this principle of universals that allows for virtue ethics, intrinsic natural rights, and deontological ethics in general. The only kind of ethics an atheistic framework can really produce is something fundamentally utilitarian. And if you think that's fine, then whatever, but don't act surprised when someone will come along and say that your system is bereft of real, substantive virtue. The fact that atheists, by and large, see no value in keeping together the family, for example, maintaining Western cultural and moral traditions, valuing ritual, the sanctity of life, societal order, as intrinsic goods derived from our nature as conceived in the divine mind, well, this just proves the point that absent Christian anthropology, you really don't have the resources you need to replace that with something nearly as enduring, binding, eternal, eschatological, and purposeful. Christianity has those resources, and you don't even have to appeal to faith to establish most of them. But one would absolutely have to rule out atheism, nominalism, and materialism. You would have to rule out those. And when you do that, as I'm showing in my Foundations of Christianity series, the road to Christianity from there is pretty much straight ahead. So that's my answer to the challenge, and let me know what you think. Thank you. In the end, you would have to rule out atheism, nominalism, and materialism to establish the benefits of Christianity that I've laid out here. You need